Hey everybody, Mr. Dustin here, and today I have my Bible class buddy with me. We'll see what he does. Sunday, we were talking about where Abraham is from, Ur of the Chaldeans, right? Well, today we're going to talk about where Abraham went. And so I want to remind us of one of our memory verses, Hebrews 11 verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. So that's Hebrews 11 verse 8. So we're going to see, where was this place? Where did he go on his travels in his life? And he really went a surprising amount of places. So let's get to it.
Boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, boom, ba boom, boom, ba 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 boom.
Now, from what I understand, over the course of Abraham's life, he traveled many miles. In many of the places he lived, he also would build an altar to the Lord. But everywhere he went, it didn't matter where he went, God was with him. And I think it's important for us to remember that. Now, Abraham began in Ur of the Chaldeans. That's what we talked a lot about on Sunday. He was there with his father Terah and his brothers Haran and Nahor. You can read about that in Genesis 11 verse 31. But they were called to leave Ur of the Chaldeans, and they went to a town called Haran, also one of Abraham's brothers. Don't get those confused. But that is in Genesis 11, verse 31 and 32. And they stayed there for a little while until God made the promise in Genesis 12. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. With that promise, God asked something of Abraham. He said, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. So he went. He left. But he took with him Lot and his wife Sarai. So they left from there, and they went to the great tree. Some translations will read the oak of Moreh, that is at a city called Shechem. You should be able to see that on the map that's on the screen. In the land that God calls Canaan Land, right? Because it's actually one of the descendants of Noah, Canaan, the son of Ham. We can read about that in Genesis 12, 6 and 7. So it is here that God tells Abraham, to your offspring I will give this land, the Canaan land. So what does Abram do there? He built an altar. Then, from there, he traveled on to a place called Bethel. And he built an altar to the Lord there as well. And there it says he called on the name of the Lord in 12 verse 8. Bethel, do you know what it means? Interesting thing. Anytime in the Bible you see a name that ends in E-L, E-L means L, it means God. So Daniel, for instance, D-A-N-I-E-L. It means God at the end of that name. And I believe Daniel's name means the Lord is God, if I remember right. Beth-El means the house of God. In Hebrew, Bet is house. And so anytime you see E-L, that means God. Whenever we read El Shaddai or El Elyon, God Almighty or God Most High. El always means God. It's kind of an interesting thing. So Bethel, house of God. And that actually gets its name from Genesis chapter 28. But Genesis was written by Moses, so it was written after the fact. So they went ahead and called it Bethel here. Then from this point, Bethel, they journey on into the Negev. Now that's south, and it's generally heading towards Egypt. But I think it's still in the land of Canaan, technically speaking. Now, the land of Canaan was very much dependent upon rainfall for its crops to survive. But Egypt was not. Egypt was a place where they had the Nile River, and they were dependent on its annual flooding for their agricultural needs. So that means when Canaan, the land of Canaan, the promised land that would be what we would receive later, the Israelites would receive, when it was in drought, it would be a famine, and they would go down to Egypt to find food. not an unusual thing. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's probably because you know the life of Joseph, and we'll actually study about that more later. But there's a famine there that brings all of the descendants of Abraham down to Egypt. So Abram, Sarai, and Lot, they went to Egypt because of this famine. And it is in Egypt that Abram actually told Sarai, his wife, he said, to call me your brother instead of your husband. Because Sarai was apparently a very beautiful woman, and Abram was afraid that the Egyptians would want to take his wife and they would kill him. So he said, just say you're my sister. Don't tell them you're my wife, that they will deal kindly with me. And it was discovered that, in fact, Sarai was Abram's wife. And so God actually sent plagues and diseases on the Egyptians. And the Egyptians sent Abram and his people away. We'll talk more about this in a second. But I suspect they left Egypt with a young woman called Hagar, that they did not go to Egypt with, but they left with her. When they came back from Egypt, they traveled through the Negev and returned to Bethel, the house of God we talked about earlier. This is where they were living before. And this is in chapter 13, 1 through 4. Now, here they ran into a problem. Both Lot and Abram had acquired a bunch of people and livestock and herds, so that the land that they were living in, it couldn't support both of them. And so they ran into these conflicts, this quarreling between their herdsmen, their shepherds. So Lot and Abram decided they needed to part company. Abram let Lot choose. He said, if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Wherever you go, I'll go the opposite. And so Lot chose to go towards the valley of the Jordan, towards Sodom and Gomorrah. It turned out that was not going to be a very good idea. So Abram chose to stay in Canaan. And I want to read this from chapter 13, 14 through 17. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So again, God promises, he said, this is the land. I'm going to give it to you. So in that land, Abram moved his tent to the great trees of the oaks at Mamre. I think Mamre is actually a person that we'll see later. And there's a town called Hebron. And that's where he lives, and he builds an altar to the Lord there. Genesis 13, verse 18. And he actually stays here for quite some time, at least as best as I can tell. And while he's here, he meets a priest called Melchizedek after saving Lot from a battle in which Lot was actually captured and taken away. So while he's living there, God makes a covenant with Abram. It's really an interesting ceremony that they go through in order to make this covenant. So God, he tells Abram, he says, take a heifer, a goat, and a ram, and cut them in half and lay them apart, opposite halves each other. And God had promised that Abram, now that he's getting older, that he would indeed have a child, and he would become as numerous as the stars of heaven. Abram was maybe troubled. He was confused. He said, how do I know that this is going to be true? Because I don't even have one child yet. So God used this ceremony basically to answer that question. The split halves, there's a smoking pot that goes back and forth in between the two halves of the animals, if you will, down the middle. And it's God himself that does that. Now, what does that mean? That's kind of weird. Apparently, in ancient times, people used to confirm a covenant by cutting animals in half and then walking in between those pieces. And if I understand correctly, basically what they're saying, the person walking between the pieces would say, if I do not uphold my end of this covenant, let me become like these slain animals. That's a pretty big promise. If you say, I will hold up my end, and if I don't, cut me in half. That is serious. And who was the one that went between the animals? It was God himself. God guaranteed that his word would come true. Now, it would be quite some time before his word was realized. In fact, it would be pretty close to 20 years from this point. And in the waiting, Abram and Sarai got a little impatient and decided that her Egyptian maidservant Hagar might be able to have children for them. Remember earlier I said Abram and his group of people were in Egypt during a famine? Well, in Genesis 12, verse 16, it says that Pharaoh, he gave Abram many gifts, livestock and various things, but among those gifts, manservants and maidservants. And I bet this is where Hagar became a part of that group. But it was not God's plan for Abram's descendants to be through Hagar. In fact, it would be through Sarah, even though they were getting old. At this point, they were pretty close to 85 or 86 years old, and Sarah was 75 or 76 years old. But their plan with Hagar ended up causing a lot of conflict for many years to come. But while they were still living in Hebron near the great trees of Mamre, there were 3 visitors that came to Abram's tent. This is whenever we get into Genesis 18. Now, these visitors, they're actually angels. And one of them is what is referred to as the angel of the Lord. And this, we believe, is what we call theophany. The idea of a theophany is whenever God comes down in flesh. He's manifested in flesh, man-type form. During the Old Testament, we see this a few times. There's a few instances of it. And we call it theophany. So these angels, they come along and they remind Abram and Sarah, again, you will have a child. In fact, they say about this time next year. And now they are 99 Abram and 89 Sarai. Basically, that means they're well past the time that people have babies. So Sarai, she laughs. And so they sort of say, you laughed, didn't you? No, I didn't. Yes, you did laugh. And so they actually name Isaac because Isaac means he laughs. And so that would be next year. That would be the name of their child that was promised to them. So God did the impossible by human standards. Now, this is also when Sarai's name changes to Sarah and Abram's name changes to Abraham. Now, from what I have read, Sarai basically means a mockery, and Sarah means princess. Abram means exalted father, and Abraham means father of many, or a whole bunch. So God took their names and he changed them to reflect his promises. Now, after this, Abraham and Sarah travel on to a place called Gerar. It's not very far from Hebron. And here, once again, Abraham asks Sarah to call him her brother instead of her husband. Again, the king of the region takes Sarah from Abraham. This time, God warns Abimelech, who was the one who had taken Sarah, of what would be done to him and what he had done. And he told him, you need to send Sarah back to Abraham. Now that all takes place in Gerar. And that takes us to the final place that we're going to read about today. It's a place called Beersheba. So after the birth of Isaac, they're still living in this place of Gerar. And there's a well that's nearby. Abraham had dug that well. But Abimelech's people, they don't really believe that Abraham dug it. And so there's kind of a fight between them. And Abraham goes to Abimelech and he says, no, I dug the well. And in order to guarantee, they settle this dispute by Abraham giving Abimelech 7 ewe lambs. And so he says, I promise, I dug this well. Here, take these ewe lambs. And so they say that they're going to make an oath to each other. And that is where we get the name Beersheba. Beer means well. Sheba means oath. The well of the oath. Because at that place, Abraham and Abimelech made an oath with each other. So the names of these places, it's interesting that they name them based on some of the things that happen in those places. So those are basically the travels of Abraham. There's a little bit more, but that's really pretty much it. And we'll get into the last piece where he goes to Mount Moriah in our next study. It's interesting to see how much Abraham really moved around. For the first few chapters we were looking at, Genesis, the end of chapter 11 through about chapter 18, he moved a lot and he covered a very great distance. And I understand at a bare minimum from Ur of the Chaldeans and where all he went to Haran and so forth, he walked all these places, and if I understand right, he traveled at least 1,500 miles. That's a lot of miles to walk. And every step of the way, God was with Abraham. Did you also notice that Abraham built altars at several of the places to the Lord in which he lived? Bethel, he set up an altar there. The trees, many times in the places he would stop, he would build an altar to the Lord. He made some serious mistakes in his life. He did some things that he shouldn't have done. But Abraham lived faithfully to God through his whole life, in spite of those problems. And that is what we need to do in order to follow the footsteps of faith of Abraham. Yes, I promise you, we will mess up. We will make mistakes. We will have sin in our lives. I guarantee that to you. But that does not mean that we just give up, and it certainly does not mean that God gives up on us. So as we go through our lives, it's important for us to do what Abraham did and keep walking towards God all the time. So thank you for joining me today for Bible class. I hope that this was fairly interesting to you to get to see some of the travels on the maps that were on the screen and to see where did Abraham go and to remember God was always with Abraham no matter what. Hope to see you next time. Hope you have a good week.